Okay, everybody can see me all right and hear and all that. So this is, I believe, the sixth week of our series, Investigating Christianity, second to last week. Last week we talked about science, and before that we spent a couple weeks on Christianity and other religions. And we started off with defining Christianity, which we're taking from the Bible, the biblical account, trying to set aside whatever traditions and opinions and so forth, and extracting the ideas from the Bible, subjecting them to some key questions along the way. All along, one thing after another is pointing to the importance of the topic that we have here tonight, which is, why believe the Bible? So, one of the things we noticed when going to the Bible and saying, all right, what does this text actually claim? What are the key claims? There's this, I think, really beautiful, simple message, which is that we were created by a personal God for a relationship with himself, and that the problems that we see on the macro and micro level in human history and in our lives have at their root diagnosis the fact that that relationship is fractured. And that the Bible is really about what God has been doing in history to allow us to get that relationship restored, which will start sort of redeeming things in this mixed up, messed up world right now, and ultimately a hope for the future that's pretty beautiful as described by the Bible. But the other thing that was of significance to me, at least, as I was doing my own investigation and thinking about it since then, is that the Bible makes this gigantic claim for itself not to be just wise humans thinking about things and persuading us, but actually claims to be communication from God through various human authors at places and times in a way that we can still see their personalities and cultures. But actually, as it says in Timothy, God breathed or superintended. So that really raises the stakes for issues like science, like we talked about last week. And when we were comparing biblical Christianity to other religions, one of the things I kept saying is that as we dove into Hinduism and Islam in particular, the writings of those faiths don't provide any objectively verifiable evidence. And I've continued to say that we need to look at that and see what the Bible has to say on its own behalf there. So that's what we want to do tonight. Is there anything that would make a reasonable basis for this gigantic claim the Bible makes for itself? We're going to break it sort of into the negatives, a set of objections that I'm going to try to move through fairly quickly because I want to wear us all out and take too much time tonight, and then the positive case. So there's a set of objections that I think are really important that I'm summarizing this way. Has the text been corrupted over the centuries? Because if that's the case, then the whole idea the Bible has, that this is somehow revelation from the personal infinite God, not just human ideas that we can sift on our own terms, that whole claim falls apart. And there's really three aspects to this. And I'm just going to hit them quickly. We can talk about more at the end if you've got questions, or let me know and I can point you to some of the more detailed evidence here. One topic is called canonicity. In other words, there's a lot of conventional wisdom that, that there's all kinds of gospels, for example, the Da Vinci Code, which is sort of pseudo claims to be scholarship, and other claims that do claim to be scholarship say things like, there's 80 different accounts of the life of Christ, hundreds of years after the fact. Some guys got together in Constantine's place and just sort of selected arbitrarily the four that we have. Things like that. So that's really important. If that's true, then, again, the whole sort of claim for the Bible falls apart. It's not true. In fact, there's specific criteria that we have known in advance, both for the Old Testament and for the New Testament books, and we watch the Jewish people through the Old Testament centuries, and then the more broad set of the church, which includes Jewish and non-Jewish followers of Christ, applying this criteria, and it has to do with authorship. So we see, for example, in the Old Testament, there was a translation of the Old Testament from its original Hebrew to Greek in 200 BC called the Septuagint. 70 scholars that were commissioned to make the translation. And so we have, since that time, a long time ago, two sets of the Old Testament books, and they are identical in terms of which books are included. Similarly, with the New Testament, we do see debates in the church stemming pretty early on, but over and over again, the same books by the criteria of being written by or somebody like Mark and Luke, who were writing on behalf of original eyewitness apostles. We see these criteria applied over and over again as different things were debated, and the set of New Testament books is actually as early as 350 BC. We have entire books with the same books we have considered New Testament today. And long before that, thousands and thousands of fragments and copies of those same books. So it's just not true that there's some arbitrary criteria long after the fact. We see these criteria being applied often within the lifetimes of the Old Testament prophets, because that's the criteria for the Old Testament, and very early on for the New Testament as well. So that takes us to the next objection, which is authorship. And again, down through the centuries, there's been a ton of attack. No book's integrity has been attacked the way the Bible's has, which is probably okay because it makes this gigantic claim for itself. And one of the common attacks is to say, the book of Daniel was not really written by Daniel when he claims to have been writing it. Here's the reasons why: manuscripts, words borrowed from other languages, or whatever. So a lot of debate on this topic. And basically, I would summarize it without having the time to go deeply into it, that both for the Old and the New Testament, there's tremendous evidence that we can actually get that these books were in fact written by whom and when they say they were. Yet a third objection has been raised. I should probably mention that a lot of people seem to feel like, well, of course you can't trust the text today because it's been translated so many times from its original Greek into this language, into that language, into that language. It's not true. We do have lots of translations, but our English translations go all the way back to the oldest original manuscripts we have. But then there's this issue of copying errors, right? Because especially for the Old Testament, which the earliest documents claim to have been written around 1400 BC, a long time before copying machines and so forth, don't we have good reason to doubt that the text that we have today may bear a little resemblance to the originals, especially the older ones? And here again, surprisingly, studying the techniques that we know from history for making these copies, extreme accuracy being required. The Dead Sea Scrolls giving an opportunity to check basically our oldest manuscripts at that time were some 900 AD back to 200, 100 BC, and finding indeed that they've been extremely accurate copying the Old Testament documents. And in the case of the New Testament, we have manuscript data that is so early, it's unbelievable. The Rylands fragment of the book of John, dated to 110 AD, you can go look at it in Ireland next time you're there, and matching the text that we have today. So I've not spent a lot of time here, but it's important. Those are all important objections. I think there's a great case to be made that whatever else you may think of the Bible, we have much more reliable than similar aged history books that everybody seems to think are good, like the Annals of Rome by Tacitus or Josephus' Jewish Wars. We can have a high confidence that what they were writing and recording as eyewitnesses is substantially accurate and transmitted down to us, and not selected arbitrarily either. All right, so that's all sort of dealing with objections, not a positive case. When we talked over the issue of truth in the spiritual realm, I suggested that the truth test would include internal consistency and does it sort of match reality, but most importantly, is there any objectively verifiable evidence for these claims that are in the beyond the material world, right? That are difficult to directly test. So that's what I want to spend the bulk of our time here on, just a quick survey that I think is unique to the Bible compared to the other works of other religions. So I phrased this topic: how does the Bible justify its claim to be revelation? Lots of people, lots of books may say they're actually communication from God. You need to have some basis for that. So let's start here, and we're going to build up on the cross-checking that we can provide from history, and then build on that to some various categories of evidence that I think are unique. So in terms of historical verification, the Bible's unique in that it provides these markers of places, times, and people that we can cross-check from other well-regarded historical and archaeological sources. So a couple of examples from archaeology: the Amarna tablets. The first ones of these were found in the 1880s. There was an objection at the time to the whole account in Exodus, the book of Exodus, of the Jewish people leaving Egypt, claimed to be around 1200, or a little earlier than that, right? And the scholarship at the time said that's a clear myth, that never happened. There's no record of that in the accounts in Egypt. And instead, it was a confused mythological version of an event that happened much later, the invasions of the Hyksos. And then these tablets were translated, and they are letters, fairly urgent letters, asking Pharaoh in Egypt for help from an Egyptian governor in the land of what we now call Israel, saying that he was being attacked by this fierce tribe, the Hebiru, which of course would be Hebrews. So that was one example where the conventional wisdom was sort of overturned, and the credence of that account went up a notch. The Ebla tablets are interesting. Back long ago when I was in college at Ohio State, taking the course The Bible as Literature, which was one nonstop, sustained attack on the integrity of the text. The professor was talking about narratives of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in Genesis, being completely mythological because there was no written language at that time. The the characteristics described in conventions were not appropriate. The names of people didn't match the culture at the time. And in the middle of that quarter, the first translations of these tablets were published. They were found, and it turned out to be the central cache, sort of financial transaction records of a previously unknown civilization right about that time, 2000 BC. And once finally people figured out this unknown language and began translating, they started to find that this is in fact validating the names like Abraham. And one of the claims was that showed that Genesis was myth, was the reference to the cities Sodom and Gomorrah. And in the Ebla tablets, there are actually trade documents of people selling and buying things from residents of Sodom and Gomorrah. The way that contracts were finalized, as described in the accounts in Genesis, we have the same methodology for contracts being described in these tablets. So my professor is really pretty honorable about it. Right in the middle of the quarter, he said, look, I've been wrong. He started sharing with us some of this initial translation data. And he said, I have to change my opinion of this account in Genesis and say it's likely to be high quality, first person eyewitness type data that we're reading about this ancient history. Sergius Paulus is another example. He's mentioned in the account in Acts as being proconsul on the island of Cyprus during Paul's missionary journey when they were traveling through there. And again, for a long time, people said, see, this is just another reason that this is all myth, written down, made up way after the fact. And then somebody uncovered an ancient building, the cornerstone of which was written, started by Sergius Paulus, proconsul, in the right years that lined up perfectly with Acts. So the general trend continues to be that archaeological data where we can cross-check these accounts is affirming. In terms of other bits of history, Tacitus, written in 110 AD, very early into the era of the church, affirms the basic facts of Jesus' death, the claims his followers were making about him, the nature of the expansion of the church. Pliny's kind of a chilling example. He's a governor. He's writing for advice to Caesar, and I think this is around 115, if I recall, 115 AD. And he says, look, there are these people called Christians, and they believe that this Christ who was crucified by Pilate, they think he raised from the dead, and they won't give up on it, and they worship him. So what I do is I torture them and I threaten them to give up that claim. And it's bizarre, he says, rich people, poor people, slave people, free people, male, female, it doesn't seem to matter. They just don't give up on this claim. And so if they won't give up, I kill them. And he's asking Caesar, is that okay? Am I doing the right thing? And Caesar says, yeah. But I mean, this is really important, as we'll see. Josephus, similarly written around 80 AD, 80 or 90, accounts that he wrote for Roman generals who befriended him, also affirms the basic outline of Jesus' life, death, and the claims of his followers. And so really, whatever else you think about these documents, Peter's claim seems to be generally assented to people that look into it carefully. We did not follow cleverly devised tales or myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Now, again, we haven't provided the kind of basis for the claim the Bible makes for itself, but I think then that addressing all of these so far provides a floor on which you can start to build for a truly positive case, empirically checkable evidence. Here are a couple of examples based strictly on those documents being accurate history. Well, people have long noticed, if you read the account of Jesus' life for yourself, don't just listen to what other people say he's like or who he is or what he said. Just read it for yourself, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's an amazing tension that starts to develop. People, even from other religions, love to say that Jesus, is a great teacher, is moral, his ethical teaching is of the highest nature. He's a prophet according to Islam. He's another incarnation of Vishnu according to Hinduism. C.S. Lewis, I think, does a great job summarizing the dilemma, though. He says, I'm trying to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him, which is, I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sorts of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God, but let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. So I encourage you to read for yourself and run these questions in your own mind and see where you land. Another very powerful argument, a number of skeptics down through the centuries have set out to deliberately disprove this claim that is positioned by the Bible itself as being so central. Jesus himself said it's the sign that would validate that he is who he says he is, and numerous texts before and after this event say that this is the premier proof that Jesus isn't just a man, he is in fact the Messiah predicted from the Old Testament and referred to by the rest of the New Testament, that he raised from the dead after being killed. So a number of people have set out to disprove that historically and written books on their experience of becoming Christians in the process. And as unusual, obviously, and overtly supernatural as this idea of resurrection from the dead is, it's interesting to just sort of think through what we know from history. And by know, I mean in the historical sense. It's not absolute mathematical proof, but it's forensically reasonable, strong case for that Jesus died by crucifixion. In other words, the Romans, who were good at this stuff and deliberately made the most of brutal, humiliating death for political enemies, people they wanted to to hold up as a negative example. They knew how to crucify people, and they did it a lot. And we know from history that Jesus died by crucifixion. I say we know that his tomb was empty, and many scholars have agreed, and the reason is that it was already known that Jesus claimed he would be raised from the dead, and early in the Christian movement, his followers were claiming that he was raised from the dead. Both the Jewish authorities and the Roman authorities who were in charge in Jerusalem throughout these events, the easiest thing to do to stop Christianity right in its tracks was to go get the body, put it on display for a while, and let everybody come by. That would have been the end of it. So they had every incentive to find the body and display it. And they didn't, and they couldn't. And in fact, the early followers of Christ, with the exception of John, who died in prison for this belief, they died rather than recant this claim that they had seen Jesus both killed on the cross and raised from the dead. And that the early church was founded on this claim. And we see this in, for example, 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul says what people believe to be a very, very early summation of the Christian belief that swept through the Roman Empire. I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. And he appeared to Peter, and then the 12, and more than 500 people at one time, most of whom are still alive. Some have died. Then he appeared to James, and then all the apostles, and Paul says, last of all, he appeared to me. So here's this clear invitation that, look, these guys are still around. Go ask them. So people have looked at this and thought, well, maybe just they thought he died. There's real problems with the idea that the Romans didn't know what they were doing, or that if they did botch the execution, that Jesus surviving this brutal event would have persuaded them that he didn't just, accidentally make it through, but was in fact renewed for eternal life and resurrected. Even more ludicrous is the idea that the disciples stole the body and made up this lie about him raising from the dead. There's absolutely no incentive. As I said, they all, except for John, were killed based on this known lie. People die for lies all the time, but to die for something that you know is a lie, especially multiple people this way, makes zero sense. And really, a lot of people have looked at this just starting from the idea that this is a historically accurate account and inferred that Jesus is who he claims to be, the Messiah, God entering history. So there's a couple of examples, and I love the hard-headedness of the Bible as a whole. It's a great example. He's saying basically, if this event didn't really actually happen in history, we should trash this whole thing. Your faith is vain. Your faith is worthless. You're not forgiven. People who have died trusting in Christ, they're gone as just like everybody else. And then he says, but Christ has been raised from the dead, and so we have hope for the future, including even death itself being swallowed up by victory, which is pretty cool. But there's more. My starting place with investigating Christianity was actually here in this issue of fulfilled predictive prophecy. In Deuteronomy 18, very early on, toward the end of Moses' career leading the people of Israel out of Egypt, he makes this statement, I will raise up a prophet from among their countrymen like you. I will put my words in his mouth, and you may say in your heart, how shall we know the word which the Lord has not spoken? In other words, asking the same question we're asking here, right? There's assuming that there's lots of fakes, lots of mistakes, lots of unreliable information about the spiritual realm. How would we know a difference between accurate and inaccurate truth versus falsehood? And far from saying you have a crappy attitude if you're even asking that question, the way that the Quran does, as we saw. It actually affirms this, and throughout the Bible we're encouraged to quit believing everything you hear. Ask for evidence, and then this business of predictive prophecy is given as one of the primary methods. When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, If the thing doesn't come about or come true, that's the thing which the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You shall not be afraid of him. And the logic here makes sense to me. If God who is who he says he is, and this book is communication from him, here's an example of the logic of the thing in Isaiah 41. Present your arguments. He's talking to the alternative religious mystical beliefs in the ancient Middle East, saying, let them bring forth and declare to us what is going to take place. As for the former events, declare what they were, that we may consider them and know their outcome, or announce to us what is coming. Declare the things that are going to come afterwards, so that we may know that you are gods. Indeed, do good or evil, do anything, he says, that we may anxiously look about us in fear together. Behold, you are of no account. Your work amounts to nothing. He who chooses you is an abomination. Saying, if this is the infinite personal God, that being sits outside of space and time and can accurately tell us the future, and that would be a good piece of evidence that that's who, in fact, is communicating. Well, there's hundreds of examples of these, and to be helpful to us, centuries distant from these writings, there's a few simple things I think that need to be in place to be persuasive. One of them is, we've already discussed, we need to be reasonably certain that the account was written before the fact, not after the fact. And then it needs to be specific enough that coincidence can reasonably be ruled out. And we need to be able to confirm the fulfillment of it in history as well. And so here are three examples of many, many we could talk about. I don't want to take too long, though. So Micah 5:2 is a famous verse. Micah was writing around 750 BC. As for you, Bethlehem Ephratah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. Well, this verse is famous because when the wise men came to Jerusalem looking for the Messiah, they went to the leaders, the Jewish leaders, and said, hey, we hear that the King of the Jews has been born. Can you tell us where we might find him? And the religious scholars immediately said, everybody knows that, Micah 5:2, it's going to be born in Bethlehem. And the interesting thing to me, too, is it's clear that this being the Messiah, the subject of all these predictions and symbols coming hundreds of years in advance, isn't just a human being, right? This is, the biblical idea of the Messiah being God. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. This being is outside time. Another one that's, for a number of reasons, important, Isaiah 53. Isaiah's writing a little bit later than Micah, around 740 BC. This passage was long held to be a fictional insertion by Christians after the fact, but the Dead Sea Scrolls contained it, and word for word, virtually, it's all in there. So let me just read a little bit of it, and we'll think about this. 700 plus years in advance of Jesus' life. Speaking of the Messiah, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we did not esteem him. Well, lots of people probably could say that's been true of them down through the centuries. Then it gets more interesting as we go along. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows, yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him. By his scourging we are healed. So this gets a little more interesting because it exactly matches the statement of all of the stuff in the Old Testament pointing to what the Messiah would do at the first coming, and what Jesus himself said he came to do, which is this central notion that we have a moral debt that we cannot clear before God and needs to be resolved, and that he's going to switch with us, take on the payment that clears that, and give us as a gift right standing with God. Scourging being part of that picture. Then he goes on, he was oppressed and afflicted, and yet he did not open his mouth. People have noted that Jesus' trial was in a number of respects illegal. And as we see, frustrating Pilate, why don't you say anything? He did say very little in his own defense, just a couple of times saying, yeah, you're right, I am the Messiah. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shears is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and who can speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken. So the Messiah dies. So that's, you might want to fake some of these other things, but the idea of trying to fake that if you were Jesus not really being the Messiah, it's hard to fathom. And then it gets even more interesting. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and yet he was with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Crucifixion victims, Rome knew how to heap the massive amount of humiliation possible, and that included the bodies being dumped in a common pit and exposed for everybody to see. That should have been Jesus' fate, but as we see in the gospel accounts, one of the Jewish leaders who secretly believed in Jesus and who was wealthy enough to own an actual rock-hewn tomb, only the very wealthy owned such a thing, actually petitioned for the body of Jesus and was granted that and buried him and with the rich, as it says. And it goes on, but the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief, if he would render himself as a guilt offering. He will see his offspring. He will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many, as he will bear their iniquities. So this actually predicts that the Messiah will die and be raised from the dead. Written 700 years beforehand. And you can see why opponents of biblical Christianity, prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was only in 1947, routinely said that this chapter was an insertion by Christians to make it look like Jesus was fulfilling prophecy. One more example, and then we'll head toward winding up here. Daniel 9. This is known as the whole chapter there, the 70 weeks prophecy. We're going to look at the 69 of those 70. And the setting here, this is Nebuchadnezzar took the remaining southern kingdom captive into Babylon, Daniel being a young man who went with him in 605 BC. Daniel's been there a long time and is observing another prophecy from Jeremiah, a guy whose life he overlapped with, that this captivity in Babylon will be 70 years. And Daniel's doing the math at the beginning of this chapter and starting to pray to God, like, are you gonna bring us back? Is it time for us to go back to the land? And this would be around 538 BC. It begins here, so you are to know and discern, this is the answer Daniel gets, that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then after the 62 sevens, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. So this is interesting because we've got a beginning, a time duration, terminating in this event of the Messiah showing up and being killed. That's what cut off means. So can we actually test whether this was fulfilled in Jesus? The beginning point is marked by not just permission to go back to Jerusalem and start rebuilding, but specific permission to rebuild with defenses, which is kind of a big deal. When you conquered a nation and a city and they'd been repeatedly causing you trouble, the last thing you wanted to do was to let them build their wall again, because you might have to come back and besiege it one more time. And so there were several points in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah that record permission being given to the Jews to come back from this captivity and begin rebuilding Jerusalem. But there's only one in Nehemiah chapter 2 which gives permission, and we actually have historical copies of this, and it's datable therefore to Nisan 1, 444 BC, permission to rebuild the defenses and not just rebuild the rest of the city. Well, what about the time frame here? This word sevens is important. We're all familiar with Sabbath or Sabbath. That's the literal Hebrew word here. It means seven. We're familiar with it being used in 7 days, the seventh day of the week. But for several reasons, people are less familiar with the fact that there's also a Sabbath year, and the context that Daniel is thinking about has to do, those 70 years that they were out was in response to yet another prophecy that if you don't obey the Sabbath year, where farmers were supposed to let their fields recover, which is good farming practice, if you don't do that, I'm going to take you out of the land until the land has its Sabbath years. And also this period of time is to rebuild and restore. It would have been, if this was considered 69 sevens of days, this would have been thrown out as a false prophecy long ago. Thinking about it as years, 69 sevens of years, to see what that works out to, we also have to account for, like most ancient cultures, the solar year was not known. The lunar year, which much more intuitive and easy to follow, was used. And of course, that meant that every now and then they had to add a leap month to get things back in line with the seasons. But 69 times 7 is 483 lunar years with 360 days, and each of one gives you a count of days. To turn that back into solar years, you divide it by 365.24 or something or other. And you get 476 solar years, and now we can try to find out where that would line up on our modern calendars, where all these ancient calendars have been synchronized and laid out for us. So starting in 444 BC, going forward in time, 476 years, you actually have to subtract, right, going forward from BC. There is no 0 year, so you add 1 as you go across, and you're left over with 33 AD. And maybe even, if you want to get really picky, take the remainder and turn it back into days, and it would give you, if this is actually nice and 1, the 30th of March on 33 AD, which turns out to be the best date for Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, to be ultimately arrested and crucified. Knowing the accuracy of the calendar and all that was not as easy for the people back then, but several historians record that a number of people had put this together and said, we're close to the fulfillment of this prediction. And there was a messianic fervor at the time, including some false messiahs. This was actually the piece of evidence that persuaded my wife Debbie to become a Christian. Maybe we'll get her to tell you about that a little bit. And so there's this wonderful moment as Jesus is coming into the city. He's been predicting his death and his resurrection to his followers. And it says, as he was now approaching near the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the miracles which they had seen, saying, Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest. Some of the Pharisees and the multitude said to him, Teacher, rebuke your disciples. Don't you hear they're basically blaspheming, calling you God, the Messiah? And he answered, I tell you, if these become silent, the stones will cry out. So from the biblical perspective, this moment is the fulfillment of God's rescue plan, sending the Messiah in to substitute for us, to buy our freedom. And if the people didn't see it, the whole physical creation would have been attuned to it. Pretty cool picture. Well, the thing I love about this kind of evidence is that it doesn't fluctuate with my feelings. Some days I feel close to God and certain, other days I don't and feel uncertain. This kind of data sits there in black and white, something independent from our inclination, and you can go off and study it, and that's what I did. This is what started me down my path of transitioning from atheism to becoming a follower of Christ. But there are many more. Psalm 22, hundreds of predictions fulfilled in the first coming, and then future unfulfilled predictions yet. I'm going to wind up with one last piece of evidence that initially made no impression on me, to be honest with you, but over the years now that I've been following Christ and continuing to work out my own questions has come to take first place for me in terms of importance. And I'm calling it internal consistency and continuity for the Bible, I mean, because this book is written across 1,500 years, across many different cultures, many different authors, and the consistency and continuity, and there's multiple layers to this. You guys all know what this is, right? This is the Ark of the Covenant. And one time I was sitting feeling kind of depressed and watching to heal my depression, turned on the TV and ended up watching Raiders of the Lost Ark. And it actually ended up working because it took my mind to this symbol, the Ark of the Covenant, or to get rid of the unnecessarily old-fashioned language, the box with the evidence. This thing was very, very early on as God began to, through Moses and the rest of the prophets in the Old Testament, describe for us in advance what he was going to do to rescue us. He told Moses, make a box, put a top on it, and there's going to be two angels looking down at what's inside the box. That box is going to hold evidence. Evidence of what? Well, the first thing that went in there were the stone tablets with the 10 Commandments on them, which, if you know the account, the nation of Israel had broken before they even got to hear them the first time. So it was actually had to make a second copy. And God says, put that in the box. That's the first piece of evidence. Evidence of what? Well, it's evidence of human failure to live up to God's moral character of goodness. The next thing that went in there as they're going from Egypt into Israel, there's a lot of bad situations that happen, and in particular, a lot of bitching and complaining. They complained against Moses and Aaron, and God had to supernaturally cause the staff of Aaron, which had obviously long dead wood, to bloom to prove that God did indeed want them in charge, and so that goes into the box. And what is that evidence of? Well, that's evidence of humans' rejection of God's leadership. So rejection of God's moral will, rejection of his leadership in our lives. And the last thing was they were bitching about food, and God gives them supernaturally for year after year this stuff called manna, which means, I guess, what is it? They could just go out in the morning and collect it, and it kept them alive as they went through the desert. And after a while, they started bitching about manna, and so God says, among other things, put a jar of the manna in the box. So what do we have there? Evidence of people's complaining and bitching about God's provision. So we reject his moral will, reject his leadership, and we complain about his provision for us. That's the evidence in the box. And so what happens is, once a year, on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, or the Day of Payment, this whole symbol sits at the temple of what was originally a tent, and then later the temple in Jerusalem. Once a year, the designated guy, the high priest, will take the blood of a sacrifice and lay it on top of that lid called the mercy seat. So what are we seeing? We're seeing a beautiful little rich picture centuries before Jesus came and fulfilled it, where we see human sin, human rebellion, human evil, and God's solution to cover that and restore us. And we could go on and on with these symbols. You know, the snake, the bronze snake that goes on the stick when the Israelites are complaining, and Jesus comes along years and 1,400 years later and says, that was a picture of me. The snake is a symbol of sin. Is all you got to do is look to it, and you can be healed. So these symbols, they're not the same way a straightforward predictive prophecy. And initially, for me, they didn't mean all that much. But as you study for yourself and you start looking at the big picture of the Bible and see how the pieces fit together, it becomes less and less plausible that this is some accidental invention of all these people that just happens to work out this way. Confirmation for me that the Bible is indeed what it claims to be, and so that we can trust its awesome promises to us. And I've not found anything else like that. as I've studied other religious systems. So I'm going to stop there. And next week, we're going to wrap this whole series up by talking about probably the single greatest objection to biblical Christianity, what philosophers call the problem of evil. So that's it. Deb can tell her story with Daniel 9.
Well, okay. I was an atheist, and of course I'd been an atheist for a little over a year. I'd become an atheist when I was 16 and begun to think through the implications of that. I was deeply depressed and what life was like if it was essentially meaningless. The end result is that your life really doesn't matter at all. And so I was wrestling with that. But anyway, ended up at a Bible study. I think I had at one point told God, look, I don't even believe in you, but if you're there, I really would like to know. So, I'll give you another chance, but, so anyway, so I went to a Bible study and kind of surprised to hear this teaching. I mean, as it was unfolding, I was like really, really listening very carefully to the Daniel 9 prophecy. And I was checking the numbers on my calculator, making sure. I was so suspicious of being lied to and manipulated. I didn't want to get sucked into something that I wasn't absolutely sure was true. As I saw this, I just thought, the Daniel 9 prophecy is so exact. There's just no way that this could happen by accident. To me, it shifted the balance of probability over to Jesus is probably God. I knew that I was a sinner. So fortunately, I had no illusions about being, a good enough person. A sinner in the sense that if a God did exist, I was probably in trouble. And so hearing the gospel was just an unbelievable relief to me that night. So I became a Christian that night, and I've never looked back. It was definitely the best decision I've ever made. But that was thanks to Daniel 9. That's my thing.
Thanks.
So,
That wasn't, I didn't give her any warning I was going to put her on the spot either.
I suspected.